The following video contains coarse language and themes of death and violence. Viewer discretion is advised. Ugh. First two books of the year, and they're both just kind of meh. I need to find something better to read. Maybe something I've already read before. Just something better. Bridge to Terabithia. Now, I read that in elementary school. Yeah, we'll do this one. There is nothing more traumatic to a child than the death of a loved one. Okay, I mean, there's other things that could happen to the child that are traumatic, but there's nothing more traumatic than a child having to deal with death. We all have experienced it. That first time that you lost a pet, or a grandparent, or a friend, or for some, sadly, a parent. We all go through it at some point, and some deal with it better than others. I remember the first death I ever experienced was the death of my great-grandmother. I was in kindergarten. My mother picked me up early from school and sat me down and said, honey, Grandma West died this morning. And I cried, because even at 5 years old, I understood that death was final and I would never see her again. When I was about 10 or 11, I had a friend who committed suicide. He was in a very abusive home, and none of the adults around seemed to really care. Or, I'm not going to say they didn't care. I think my mother knew about what was going on, but it's one of those situations where it's scary to report it. And I understand, but there's still a bit of anger inside of me that this 10-year-old kid killed himself because of the abuse he was dealing with, and none of the adults in the situation who knew what he was going through did anything about it. And then, of course, recently, within the last few years, my grandfather passed away. And while I was very angry at the death of my friend, when my grandfather passed away, I was actually in shock for a little bit. It took me a little bit to finally break down, because for the first hour or so that I was told he was dead, it didn't resonate with me. Every child reacts differently to death. Katherine Paterson, who wrote Bridge to Terabithia, in my opinion, encapsulates that perfectly. The entire story is about a boy named Jess who makes friends with a girl named Leslie. And Leslie's a bit weird. She comes from a city. She's living in this southern town. Her family is often referred to as hippies because they don't act the same way that the people around them do. Jess comes from a family full of women. He has no brothers. They're all sisters. And he and Leslie bond over the fact that they're kind of weird. They're kind of different. He's the only boy in his family. She's a single child who has parents that society within this town don't really understand. And they bond over that. And for those of you that have heard of Bridge to Terabithia, have watched the show, have read the book, you know for a fact that Leslie does die towards the end of the book. And Jess's reaction to her death, in my opinion, is almost perfect. Not because I enjoy seeing children react to the death of friends, but because not everyone just breaks down and cries. When he first finds out of Leslie's death, he's in denial. He accuses people of lying to him, and he runs away. And his father basically has to go get him and bring him home. After that, he's in shock. Someone even makes the remark, oh, that girl died. And he looks at his parents and says, what girl? He doesn't even recognize that his friend's dead. He's in complete shock. And then when he finally comes to terms with her death, he lashes out and becomes enraged. He starts screaming about how he hates her, and his father has to hold him and comfort him as he cries. Not everyone just cries. I remember going to the funeral of that boy, that friend of mine that killed himself, and I was talking to a couple of his cousins. I don't know if they were younger than him or older than him, but they were around the same age. And one of them was just in denial. She kept asking why. Why is he gone? Why did he kill himself? Because she was young and she couldn't grasp the idea of suicide, let alone one of her relatives committing suicide. And then there was another relative who was just angry. She blamed his brother, she blamed his parents, she blamed everyone. It was someone else's fault. It couldn't have been him. He couldn't have killed himself. It has to be someone else's fault. Now, you could say that this is a proper reaction to someone who loses a relative to suicide, because you want to think, maybe I could have done something else. Maybe it was someone else's fault. There's no way they could have taken their own life. But everyone responds differently to grief. And what really made me cry when I was reading Bridge to Terabithia wasn't so much Leslie's death, but the response of the people around her. The teacher who broke down crying, saying she was one of her best students. Jess having to come to terms with her death. And then just her parents. Her parents were just completely devastated by it. They couldn't even take her dog with them because it was too hard on them to take the dog. So they ended up giving her dog to Jess. There are a few very, very minor issues that I have with this book. And when I say minor, I mean very minor in comparison to the excellent writing, the great character development, and just the story as a whole, and the idea of grief and healing from grief and finding hope despite loss. One of the issues I have is there's this theme of, will God send children to hell? Because Leslie was not big on reading the Bible. And Jess's sister, I believe her name was Maybeth, or Mary Beth. Maybell. She made the remark that if you don't read the Bible, you go to hell. And Leslie's just like, well, I don't think God would send children to hell. And the last phrase of that chapter is, well, what happens if you die, Leslie? And that made me think, I'm like, okay, she's gonna die. I know she's gonna die because the book literally just hand-wrapped her death and gifted it to me. See, this is gonna happen. And it's like, with how traumatic Leslie's death is on Jess and everyone else, if you basically tell the readers, hey, she's gonna die, that takes away the trauma that could be then foisted upon the reader as well. Because I'm guessing that Katherine Paterson, oh wow, I've been pronouncing her name wrong this entire time. Katherine Paterson, I'm guessing she wanted Leslie's death to be a shock to the readers too. So having that line of, well, what happens if you die? And she made it a point to italicize the word die. It just kind of gave it away a little too much. Alright, and then the other issue... I'm trying to think. No, I don't think there is another issue. I think that was the only problem I had with Bridge to Terabithia. Is that, actually yes, now I remember, Leslie herself. So Leslie is kind of portrayed as a bit of a Mary Sue, which, I doubt the author's watching this. I don't even know if she's still alive. But if she is, she might say that there is a point to this, but I found her to be just a little too perfect. A little too, yeah, I'm weird, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with me. I'm perfect in every way. I break down boundaries by racing against boys in the playground, and I'm a perfect student, and I'm just awesome and creative, and I want to try all of these new things. She just comes across as a little too much of a Mary Sue. And again, if the death wasn't showcased to us, then maybe her death would have been a bit more traumatic because of that. This absolute perfect character, this child that was perfect in every way, is cut down because life's a cruel bitch. But I did find her to be a bit too perfect. But then again, the trauma for me reading the book was not her death, but the reaction of people to her death. So I'm willing to give that a little bit of a pass. Overall, Bridge to Terabithia is a pretty damn good book. I love the world building, I love the characters. There are people who are flawed in this book, but at the same time, you appreciate that they're flawed. Again, if you don't count Leslie. Everything about this book is just perfect. There's a reason they have children read these books in school. I read this in elementary school. I loved it then. I love it now. It was a great nostalgic trip for me. And if you haven't read it and you're perfectly okay with the fact that I spoiled this book for you, I highly recommend it. I also recommend the movie. It's a bit too saccharine for me because there's a grittiness and a grunginess, in my opinion, to the book that's missing in the movie. However, the scene where Jess is breaking down to his father about Leslie's death was perfect in that movie. Best scene of the movie. But if you haven't seen the movie or read the book, I do highly recommend it. And aside from those two very, very minor issues, I have absolutely no complaints for Bridge to Terabithia. I'm going to go ahead and give it an A.